So, artificial general intelligence, or AGI, only topic worth discussing, and we're not talking about general AI, we're definitely not talking about generative AI. The reason for that is that generative AI is simply not up to the task. It is a probabilistic-based method. That's all it can do. A couple of quick examples to just bring home that point. These are a couple of examples that have been well plastered about the internet lately. For example, asking Gemini 1.5, I know they've withdrawn this capability, but the early test of Gemini 1.5 was, show me a picture of a 1943 German soldier, and it comes up with a very handsome young African-American man, very likely not what the Germans would have been putting in uniform at that time. Then things like, show me a picture of a pope, and then it comes up with a lovely East Indian woman and a black gentleman, each of them garbed in appropriately seeming white and gold pontifical garments. But to the best of my knowledge, Holy Mother Roman Catholic Church has not yet made a woman pope, at least not within recent historical records. And another recent example, again, probing Gemini 1.5 in its poor, misfated early adventures. We do offer a lot of heartfelt sympathy for them. Show me a picture of a 17th century physicist, and it came up with a lot of pictures. One of them, the most interesting that I found in this collection, was the Central American woman, bare-breasted, full regalia, feathers and various accoutrements, standing next to a chalkboard with equations. 17th century physicist, yep. So, I'm not saying that Central American Indian women were not doing physics in the 17th century. We don't know for sure, but that's not how they're typically portrayed. So those are instances of a generative AI making a mistake because we're overlaying too woke a directive on top of something that is strictly probabilistic. It has no intelligence, it has no understanding, it has no ontology, no access to symbolic representation. It is simply looking for things next to things, signal tokens next to signal tokens next to signal tokens on down the line. And yes, it's got a lot of beautiful probabilistic encoding. It can go miles down the road in terms of the sinusoidal waves. Yes, it's got multi-head attention. Those are sitting on top of the basics for generative AI, which, as we all know, are the reverse Kullback-Leibler divergence, the use of Bayesian conditional probabilities, that's the important part, and then a nod to statistical thermodynamics. Let's just take a couple more examples that have pushed forth the foibles of generative AI. Again, we're just after context. This second example is actually from my own personal experience. And I was putting together a little tiny backgrounder on Themesis for our website and doing a little bit of Googling on the two goddesses, Themis and Nemesis. Themis being the Greek goddess of divine counsel, good guidance, wisdom. She was the oracle at Delphi that kings traveled for miles through arduous conditions to consult with her before going into battle or making other crucial decisions. And Nemesis, as we all know, is the goddess of retribution. Nemesis is what you deal with if you don't pay attention to Themis. They even have two temples that were situated next to each other in ancient Greece. So, back to our story. Nemesis. I'm Googling her, getting all the expected Greek goddess stuff. And then all of a sudden, there's Nemesis shows up wearing a red leather jacket and black jeans. And I'm having one of these moments like, whoa, okay. Google's Gemini 1.5, and I'm sure many other LLMs were just not trying to cast the blame strictly on 1.5, but it conflated ontologies. It combined an ontology coming from the classic Greek mythology, from an ontology element coming from a wiki for a fandom for, it could be an online game or something of that ilk. One more example. We probably all know this particular one. Somebody asked one of the great LLMs, it might have even been ChatGPT for all I know. The question was, which is bigger, a Great Dane or a Mini Cooper? And the chat engine went through all of its various rationales and said, obviously that Great Dane is bigger than the Mini Cooper. Okay. This is a failure of common sense reasoning. So let's go through all of these. First of all, what we've got with generative AI, we all know this. I'm just saying this like to establish the record and give us some context here, but it is a strictly probabilistic method. You have to have things next to each other, and that's what it calls over succeedingly lengthy periods of time with this sinusoidal positional encoding. And we know it has multi-head attention. We know that stuff, alrighty? We know that for something to pop up in any of the LLMs, it has to be pre-existing in some manner of speaking. In some form, somebody wrote it down, because all it's doing is finding things that are next to each other. It has no sense of ontology, no sense of built-up knowledge about the world. It's just what terms are next to each other. This is its great strength, and of course, its great downfall, its great weakness. This is, for all practical purposes, and this is the beauty of it, because we're pushing the limit. When we're over 1 trillion parameters, we know that adding another 1 trillion more, it's not going to make a big difference. So what we're seeing is the limitations of the method. And the limitations are very simply, we're not going to get much beyond probabilities. This is equivalent to the earlier Ptolemaic astronomy system, astrology being a little bit combined in those days, but the Ptolemaic was the geocentric. Everything went around the Earth, okay? And that was the prevailing wisdom for a long time. Copernicus, a Renaissance scientist, was the first who is widely known to have proposed the heliocentric model for the solar system. Up until then, it had been, of course, geocentric or Earth-centered, and after Copernicus, Galileo espoused the same and was forced to recant by the Roman Catholic Church. The scientist Johannes Kepler was the one who followed and proposed elliptical orbits for the planets. But back before they finally gave up on that geocentric, they had this Ptolemaic system, and they kept having to add on little twiddles, little fixes, little curlicues and embellishments, because it wasn't working. And that's what's going on right now. We've got a system that is our current equivalent to the Ptolemaic. Everything goes around the Earth version, and it doesn't work, and we're adding little fixes, and God help us all, we're adding certain diversity rules on top of it, which really muck things up a bit. The fault isn't in the algorithm, because it's a fine algorithm. It just can only do what it can do. So here's what we need. We need to encompass the fact that we have two existent kinds of AI. The best, the richest, the deepest, the most well-worked version of that second kind, the symbolic knowledge AI, is something that Google already has. They've been working on it for well over 10, 12 years. They've put people time into refining it, not just algorithms. People have been checking these things, and it's the Google Knowledge Graph. And here's an example. I pulled this one just before going to the Trenton Computer Fest. Here's another example I pulled in Paris. I would have shown the audience the Trenton Knowledge Graph, but it was actually much bigger and much more detailed and took up more space. And somebody at Google must really like Trenton, New Jersey, because there's a lot more pictures and a lot more detail about Trenton, New Jersey than there is about Paris. But you're all familiar with this. You type in your query, and in your upper right, you get a knowledge graph box, and it's filled in. And here's the thing. This is old AI. But what we have are ontology slots. So as soon as they identify the nature of a thing, there are specific slots that get filled in for the thing. So for example, if you're talking about a city in the United States, such as Jersey City, which is neighboring Manhattan, you'll get its zip codes, its area codes, its population, and interestingly enough, its police chief, which might be important. Suppose that you're Googling up a famous scientist like Geoffrey Hinton. You get all sorts of rich details. Where did the person go to study? What did they do? Where their current position is? Where they've worked? What their major innovations are? In other words, it's detailed, it's specific, and it's not probabilistic. No, it's absolutely filled in and checked. It's been checked by human beings before the big ones go out there, and by now they've had enough human beings whom they've paid a little bit, out of the limelight to check almost all the relevant facts. Now here's the thing. That ontological knowledge, not only is it not probabilistic, but it's more or less relatively stationary. right? Somebody got born on a certain date. They got born on a certain date. And cities don't typically move around in the landscape. The first base layer of ontology is firm, fixed knowledge. On it, as we move forward, because we must work with an ontological-based system. We're going to have things that are current as of a certain date, or current with a certain actual probability, like our best guess is such and such, or things that are evolving right now but are subject to change. So we will talk about that in future vids because that needs to become a vital element of our conversation. We're going to get AGI in 5, you can count them off, 5 major evolutionary steps. Number 1, we've already discussed this. You need the symbolic as well as this is an old term, but signal processing knowledge layers. I can find a few references and I'll try to find some and stick them into an associated blog. But the notion of different kinds of knowledge representation, that's 1980s stuff, and it hasn't really gone away. Okay? We still need that. A great deal of the not so much semantic is a symbolic, but the syntactic is now being embedded in the signal level world because we're able to identify more in the way of relationships within the signal level data itself. But there's still that great divide between signal level at the bottom, and we'll just put symbolic up at the top, and they need to coexist. First of all, that's step 1. Step 2, we need to connect the two. And this is why in the past 50 years, we can trace modern AI back to 1974. Paul Werbis invents back propagation, stories on that later. And William Little invented the energy-based neural network that has come to be known as the Hopfield. It's really the Little Hopfield neural network, and that was the predecessor for the Boltzmann machine, which is the predecessor for the restricted Boltzmann machine, which is the predecessor for the, everything, deep learning, GANs, the whole genre of generative methods that have sprung from that moment. But it's a 50-year history. So 50 years of neural networks and truly generative AI, and also symbolic even predates that. So we've got both of them. We need to connect them. Over the past 50 years, that has not happened in a very good sense. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having the problems that we have right now, for example, with the recent Gemini 1.5 fiascos, or just the fact that we've had to throw so many parameters, so much energy, so much computing resources just to get a simple answer out of ChatGPT. We need to connect the two. That connection is something that we're going to talk about and fill that in a little bit today. And we will be filling it in more and more as time goes on. As we get that connection to happen, we need a control system because the connection mechanism, which is in itself a statistical mechanics-based neural network and a little bit more complex than what we're used to, it's going to have a control system based on just 2 parameters. This is the great big external control loop, 2 parameters, and we'll talk about that more because what that will do is let us draw in some novel ideas from brain physiology about metastable states, having avalanche-like responses, things like that. So that's point 3. We're going to need a control system, at least for the major external control loops. Then point 4. Once we get that in place, and we will have more intricate and detailed internal control systems, I'm jumping over a number of things, we can bring in those things that have been worked on by really great researchers for the past 50 years, really. Things like reasoning under uncertainty, common sense reasoning, temporal reasoning, all of that very good, very carefully, elegantly worked. Beliefs, even. How do you express a belief that someone or something has about something else? That's a complex thought. So that can start to be invoked once we get a connection between our signal level processing and the symbolic. So that would be step 4. Step 5, rounding it all out, is we need to encapsulate a boundary around the AI system, the AGI system truly, so that it has a sense of self, so that it has a sense of I am receiving information from my environment and I am exerting an action upon my environment. Only when it has that demarcation, truly a really nice, firm little Markov boundary in there, can we start to have rules that truly, this is the big alignment issue. And we can go back to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, things like a robot will not hurt a human being. But for today, 5 major architectural components. Now I'm going to take this just a little tiny bit further. We're going to talk about that connection method. How do you actually get from any kind of single level element up to something at the symbolic level? There's going to be two parts to that. They are both encompassed in what I'm calling a corticon, but really we're splitting the corticon out into 2 major elements, one of which I've not discussed before, and it needs to be brought up now. And that is that we have ontologies that must be a mirror image. They must actually be a projection forth, let's put it that way, a projection of the symbolic ontology, which is where you keep all your symbolic knowledge, like a city is in a certain location, a city is residing within a country, a city has these geographic boundaries, that kind of information. That's ontological. You can even put in relationships between things, such as a city has a neighboring distance to another city, or it has a sister city, or some sort of other relationship that you could encode as a connection between 2 ontological elements. We need something else. We're going to need an activation ontology. That is, the same formal structure. It's going to have a projection of that structure, but its job is not to hold the detailed information. Instead, it's to have activations. And the signal layer must, through the middle layer, the corticon, the connecting layer, activate ontology elements. And here's what gets interesting. You need to have activation interactions, activation propagations, truly, throughout the ontology, not just upwards. I'm going to give you a very, very quick little example here. You want activations to propagate downwards as well. And I will pick up this example in a future vid, and we'll work through it with a few slides and talk about it in a bit more depth. But imagine that you're talking about a confirmation in the Senate of a appointment that the president wants to make for the Supreme Court. Okay. This involves 3 different elements of the United States federal government. There's 3 different branches that we have. One is the executive, and the office of the president is dominantly representing the executive branch. Then we have the legislative, which has 2 parts. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives, and only the Senate is involved in confirming an appointment to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court is an element of the judicial branch, which is, of course, the remaining 3rd branch. So suppose that we start off talking about the Senate, and this conversation about the Senate might conceivably push its way upwards to the notion of the full legislative body if you have a little tiny bit of involvement from the House of Representatives. But it's entirely possible that we could have a long, long discussion about whether or not the Senate will confirm the president's appointment and not mention the House at all. So maybe we're going to look at a little activation coming down from the higher level node representing that federal government down to the middle node representing the legislative branch of the United States, and then back and forth between that and the Senate. Now, how would we get that topmost node activated, the one that represents the federal government in total? Well, you've got to have activation with the executive branch. And yes, you can get that pretty easily. We can make it pretty straightforward for activation of, say, the Oval Office to move up and activate the entire executive branch node, and that should move up and activate at least partially, give it a little oomph to the federal government. But then it's that talk about another node in the system, the judicial, the Supreme Court being enough to activate the judicial system of the federal government, and that should propagate up in the combined activation of 2 sources. Executive and judicial should be enough to say, oh, we are really talking about the federal government, not just one particular branch. Once the federal government gets activated, you should be able to then drive down an activation to hit the entire legislative branch, especially since you've got activation coming up from the Senate. So you see, this is a little bit complicated. This is the simplest little back of an envelope example that I could come up with, and it's still just a little tiny bit complicated. And we're thinking about how we're going to get activations to move up and down. How do you get activations to be persistent over time? That's the thing, isn't it? The whole question is persistent activations. When we take a look at that Vaswani et al. Paper, the one that introduced transformers, Attention is All You Need, 2017, that one, and you read their introduction, you realize, oh, these guys are very, very focused on how do we overcome the limitations of previous neural networks that were attempting to address temporal relationships between things over time. And they reference recurrent neural networks. We all know the difficulties with those. And they also referenced long short-term memory networks. And again, we know those were pretty effective, but very rigid, very sort of mousetrappy is what I say. On, off, depending on certain triggers. Not fluid, not the kind of sensitive architecture that we would want to ride on for a long time. So transformers, multi-head attention, positional encoding, fabulous breakthrough. And they are truly addressing this issue of how do we get temporal relationships across really a large range of elements in the signal layer. We're seeing the limitations. We still need to get persistent activation in some sort of neural network. It's going to be the corticon that can hold activations over time. And let me give you a little tiny example, and then we'll close with this vid and pick up with the next one. So right now, neural networks are constructed so that, imagine that you've got an office suite, and every worker, these are the latent nodes, every worker is somewhat siloed. They have tall cubicle walls separating them from their coworkers, and they receive in inputs and they process it, and they don't talk to anybody. They just process it and push it up to the management layer above them. That is, they do their feature detection, and every neural network latent node detects a very specific kind of feature. In isolation, no interaction. It just does its job, pushes it up, forgets what it just did. I know, long short-term memory, a little memory, but not quite the robustness that we want for the long term. So, typically, these nodes forget. And yes, I know, memristors and other things are coming in. They're still not quite what we're running for the full general AI. Now, imagine that instead of nodes working singly, take it in, process, push it up, forget, take it in, process, push it up, forget. You have nodes that, oh, this thing that's coming in, it looks important, and I'm getting several mentions of the same thing. I need to call in a team, and the team needs to cluster together, collaborate, share a little bit of information about this, and stay a little bit persistently active on this thing, even as other bits of information are being picked up and processed by other individuals or teams. And as something begins to drop, the team activation can fall off over time. You don't need as many neurons, but you still want a few, and you still want a little bit of connection between one individual node or a small cluster or team of nodes and other individuals or clusters or teams. Now, there hasn't been a mechanism to do that up until now. That's why we've had corticons. Up until now, I've been soft shoeing the whole corticon thing. I've introduced it. I spent several months creating context for it. There's a lot of YouTubes on like, oh, let's create a context for a new kind of neural network. There are a whole slew of YouTubes that explain what they are as gently as possible. We do show the equation, but by no means take you to derivations. There's a little bit of code and code walkthrough. There's at least one worked example. There's enough to give you a sense and feel. What I haven't done, of course, was to discuss why we rather desperately needed these corticons. And that's because I wanted to place that notion out there and give you some toys to play with, because the physics is a wee little bit more complex than usual, and we know that most people in neural networks Even though they may be very robust in many areas, not everybody's mastered the requisite statistical thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, same thing for our purposes. So we in Themesis took a little tiny vacation and went and developed a short course in top 10 terms in statistical mechanics, which actually evolved because we kept throwing in bonus materials to be really a very solid introduction to generative AI. That wasn't our plan. We were doing this, honestly. We were doing this for strictly selfish reasons, which was we wanted you to be able to read what we have to offer in the way of corticons, which we believe will help a lot with the whole artificial general intelligence issue, and we knew that most people couldn't get through the equations without at least a little bit of help. Well, we were determined to present stepping stones, if you will, and now the stepping stones are there. So we can start to talk about corticons and their role in AGI with a little bit more fullness, shall we say, than previously. Now, we're going to close. There's a lot that you might want to contemplate, beginning with the fact of if these corticons are so useful, and really what they are is a neural network engine wrapped around the cluster variation method developed in 1951 by Kikuchi, embellished in 1967 by Kikuchi and Brush. I did my PhD work on it, which is why I happen to know it. Very, very few people in the world understand those equations. It's kind of like, just to give you a quick analogy, it's kind of like if you were going to learn how to play bridge, okay? You could master the rules in an evening, not a question. You would spend a lifetime studying the nuances of the game, like what cards, what combinations, what play should I make given what I'm holding in my hand and what I've seen other players make. Similar if you're teaching yourself Go or chess. Rules are easy. Getting the context, getting the subtleties, getting the nuances, getting experience so that you easily recognize when one thing is next to another, what it means. That takes a little time. And that's really what we've got with corticons. They're a neural network that is embodied around a statistical mechanics core, and that statistical mechanics is, as I said, a wee bit more complicated, takes a little while longer to learn. So what you have at your disposal right now, YouTube's, a whole playlist, I think a couple of playlists by now. We have blog posts backing that up. We have research papers, both published and on archive. We have code for the one-dimensional case. We've been releasing that publicly so you can pull down a bit of code where we give you an example. It's a worked example. Just plop it into your Python idle, hit the run button. Oh, it works. And then you can tinker with it a little bit just for fun. We've got all that available to you. It's free. Massive ramp-up materials are available at your disposal. But if you're serious about creating AGI, you may want to have a little bit of communication with Themesis. And that's where we come in as a muse. We are a muse, both as a corporation. We are a collective muse. I personally am a muse. If you and your people are going to learn this, you may want to interact with us. So shoot us an email. However, please be aware, we are very careful about protocols right now. So do your due diligence. Contact us via email to set up a time that we can talk briefly to see if you're an appropriate client. We do not pitch you. If you want to learn about this, there's plenty of self-education material available by now. We do not try to convince you that this is something that you should do. If you're interested, there's plenty of YouTubes that'll give you a lot of depth and a lot of material supporting that. And we're not going to dog and pony you. You should come to the meeting very thoroughly prepared, even that first meeting. So that means that at least one person on your team should have opened up the code, run the code, done the code walkthroughs, gone and looked at the original research papers, and you should have a pretty good sense of who in your team can work with this, what you think you might do, and why it is that you're asking for us to interact with you. So with all those caveats in place, if you're interested in talking with us, the first thing to do, of course, is send us an email. But prior to that, look at our Muse tab on our website. This tab suggests various ways in which you can interact with us. Once you've done that, send us an email and we'll set up a conversation. So thank you. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Once again, Aliana Merven from Themesis. Have a lovely day.